The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Harriet Voss learned that the house her mother had left her was no longer, legally speaking, hers. She stood in the solicitor's office on Grantham Street, with her hands folded in front of her and her face perfectly still, the way her mother had taught her to stand when something was trying to break you. The solicitor, a small man named Mr. Pemberton, who had the unfortunate habit of not meeting her eyes, shuffled papers and spoke in the direction of his desk. The will, he said, had been contested. Her uncle, Bernard Voss, had filed the challenge 18 months ago. The courts had ruled in his favor 3 weeks prior. He was sorry. He was very sorry. Harriet said nothing. She walked out onto Grantham Street, stood in the October air, and looked at nothing in particular for a long moment. Then she walked to the corner, sat down on a bench that was damp from the morning's rain, and thought very carefully about what she was going to do. The house was called Ashford Park. It sat on 40 acres in the county of Devonshire, and it had belonged to the Voss family for 4 generations. Her mother, Catherine Voss, had been the last of the direct line, a quiet, practical woman who had spent her life maintaining the estate with the same attention she gave everything. Steadily, without complaint, without asking for recognition. When Catherine died of a fever 2 winters ago, Harriet had assumed she would simply step into that role. She was 24. She was the only child. It had seemed straightforward. She had not counted on Bernard. Her mother's brother had appeared at the funeral looking aggrieved and proprietary, the way men sometimes looked when they saw something they felt they deserved. He had kissed Harriet's cheek and told her she was the image of her mother. 2 weeks later, she received the first legal notice. The challenge had taken 18 months. Bernard had argued, through a series of increasingly elaborate legal maneuvers, that Catherine had not been of sound mind when she signed the final version of her will. He had produced witnesses Harriet had never heard of. He had produced documents she was certain were wrong. Mr. Pemberton, when she had asked him directly whether the challenge had any merit, had looked at his desk and said, "These things were complicated." 3 weeks ago, the court had agreed with Bernard. Harriet sat on the bench on Grantham Street and thought about what she knew. She knew the house. She knew the staff, the grounds, the east wing that flooded every spring, the kitchen garden her mother had planted the year Harriet was born. She knew where her mother kept her private correspondence, in a cedar box under the window seat in the study, correspondence that included, she was nearly certain, letters that would directly contradict at least 2 of Bernard's witnesses. She could not get into the house. Bernard had changed the locks the day after the ruling. She had learned this from Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, who had telephoned Harriet in London with barely concealed outrage and a voice that shook only slightly. The new master, Mrs. Holt said, had also let go of 3 of the longer-serving staff and brought in 2 of his own people. Harriet had thanked her. She had hung up. She had sat with the information for 3 weeks, turning it over the way you turned over a locked box, looking for the place where it gave. And then, this morning, she had seen the advertisement in the Times. Ashford Park was to host the county autumn gathering, a formal dinner attended by most of the county's notable families in 11 days. It was by tradition the most significant social event of the late season. The new owner, it noted, would be receiving guests alongside the Duke of Cavendish, who held the adjacent estate and whose endorsement, socially speaking, was worth more than almost anything else in Devonshire. Harriet had read the notice twice. Then she had gone to her appointment with Mr. Pemberton, learned what she already suspected she would learn, and sat on a bench in the October cold. She took out a piece of paper and wrote a short letter. It was addressed to Mrs. Holt. The position was for a temporary parlor maid, required for the duration of the gathering and the preparation beforehand. Mrs. Holt had apparently found herself short-staffed after the dismissals and had been quietly authorized to hire additional help through a domestic agency. The agency, Harriet had discovered, was in Exeter, not London. The woman who ran it had taken Harriet's fabricated references without much scrutiny and had seemed primarily interested in whether she could carry a tray without listing to one side. Harriet could carry a tray. She had grown up watching every maid in that house do it. She arrived at Ashford Park on a Wednesday morning, 11 days before the gathering, in a gray dress with a white collar and her hair pinned so far back that she barely recognized herself in the mirror. She had a new name, Margaret Cole, and a history she had constructed carefully over the preceding week. She had practiced it until it sat naturally. She was from Somerset. She had worked in 2 households previously. She was quiet and did not ask unnecessary questions. Mrs. Holt met her at the servants' entrance. The housekeeper was a solid woman in her 60s who had run the household since before Harriet was born. She looked at Harriet for a long moment without any change in expression. "The east parlor needs dusting," she said. "Start there." That was all. The house was both entirely familiar and deeply wrong. The furniture was the same. The smell of the hallways was the same. Beeswax and old wood, and faintly, the lavender her mother had kept in ceramic bowls in the corridor. But Bernard had moved things. The small portrait of her grandmother that had hung at the top of the stairs was gone. In the library, her mother's books had been pushed to the far shelves and replaced at eye level with a set of matching volumes that looked as though they had been bought for the appearance of having been read. Harriet dusted the east parlor and did not let herself think about it. The other temporary staff were 2 women from the village. Anne and Claire, both practical and incurious, more interested in discussing the gathering's menu than in Harriet's origins. The permanent staff who remained were Mrs. Holt, the cook Mrs. Briggs, a footman named Thomas, and a young girl named Polly who helped in the kitchen. None of them, other than Mrs. Holt, had known Harriet before. She settled into the rhythm of the house. She was careful to be useful without being memorable, to answer when spoken to and not speak otherwise, to do the work without making the work about her. In the evenings she sat in the servants' hall and listened, while Thomas speculated about whether the gathering would go well, and Anne described the floral arrangements being planned for the dining room. On the 4th day, the Duke of Cavendish arrived to discuss the gathering with Bernard. Harriet was in the hallway outside the library when they arrived. She had not planned it. She was carrying a stack of clean linens to the upstairs cupboard, and she simply happened to be there when the front door opened, and she had just enough presence of mind to keep walking steadily toward the staircase. She had met the Duke of Cavendish once when she was 17 at a Christmas gathering her mother had hosted. He had been polite and distant in the way that men with serious responsibilities often were, and she had not thought of him since. She thought of him now with considerably more attention, because he was the one person in the county whose endorsement Bernard Voss most needed, and whose doubt, if cultivated carefully, could destabilize everything Bernard had built here. His name was Arthur Pemberton Cross, and he had the look of someone who read contracts carefully and meant what he said. Bernard greeted him in the hallway with the particular warmth of a man who was trying very hard. Harriet reached the staircase and went up, and did not look back. She found the cedar box on the 6th day. She had waited until the house was quiet. Bernard in his study after dinner, Mrs. Holt in her sitting room, the rest of the staff settled for the evening, and then she had gone to her mother's study on the 2nd floor. It was the room Bernard had changed least, perhaps because he had not yet decided what to do with it. The window seat was still there. The cedar box was still under it. It was locked. Harriet sat back on her heels and looked at it. She had known her mother kept a small brass key in the spine of the dictionary, on the third shelf. She stood, walked to the shelf, tilted the dictionary, and heard the key slide. She opened the box. The letters were there. 3 from Bernard himself, 2 of them discussing, in terms that were not remotely consistent with his testimony about Catherine's state of mind, plans he had made with her directly about the estate. A 4th letter from a neighbor named Mistress Ashby, describing a conversation with Catherine 2 months before her death, in which she had been, in his words, entirely herself and entirely clear about her intentions. Harriet read each of them twice. Then she took out the small notebook she had begun carrying in her apron pocket and wrote down dates, names, the specific language that contradicted specific testimony. She replaced the letters exactly as she had found them. She locked the box. She put the key back in the dictionary. She went back to her room and lay awake for a long time. The difficulty was this. She could not simply remove the letters. They were not, legally, hers to take. Not yet, not while the ruling stood. If she took them, Bernard could argue they had been interfered with. What she needed was for someone else to find them, or rather, for the question of their existence to be raised in a context she did not control. She thought about this for several days. She thought about it while she dusted and carried trays and listened to Thomas describe the gathering seating arrangements. She thought about it while she ironed tablecloths in the laundry room, and while she laid fires in the guest rooms, and while she walked past the library and heard, twice, the sound of the Duke's voice inside, steady and deliberate, asking Bernard questions that Bernard answered with too many words. She noticed that about Arthur Pemberton Cross. He asked short questions. The longer someone's answer, the more still he went. She had not spoken to him. She had passed him in hallways, filled his water glass at dinner when she was serving, handed him his coat once when he was leaving. He had not looked at her in any particular way. She was a parlor maid in a gray dress. She was furniture. This was, she reminded herself, the point. On the 8th day, 3 days before the gathering, she made a decision. She wrote a letter. Not to the Duke. She was not foolish enough to do that directly. She wrote it to Mr. Ashby, the neighbor who had written to her mother, whose own letter was sitting in the cedar box. She told him, carefully and without explaining how she knew, that there existed correspondence in the Ashford Park study that she believed he was aware of. She suggested that if he had concerns about the recent legal proceedings, the gathering might be an occasion on which to raise them, discreetly, with the appropriate party. She mailed it herself, on her afternoon off, from the village post office. The night of the gathering arrived cold and clear. Harriet spent the morning helping set the long table in the dining room, 24 settings with the good china her mother had bought in Bath. The silver polished to a degree that Thomas complained would give him wrist trouble for a week. The flowers were deep red and white, arranged in low bowls along the center. Her mother had always done them that way, because tall arrangements blocked conversation, and her mother had believed in conversation. Bernard arrived in the dining room at midday and stood looking at it with the expression of a man assessing a painting. He wasn't sure he'd paid the right price for. He adjusted one of the chairs. He told Thomas the napkins should be folded differently. He left. Harriet refolded the napkins exactly the way they had been. The guests began arriving at 6. Harriet was stationed in the entrance hall to take coats, a role she had requested from Mrs. Holt with the mild explanation that she was good with names and faces. Mrs. Holt had looked at her for a moment and then said fine. She watched the county file in. She recognized most of them, the Ashby family, the Pembrokes, Mrs. Latimer, who had been her mother's closest friend and who pressed Bernard's hand with a warmth that did not reach her eyes. Mr. Ashby, when he arrived, handed Harriet his coat without looking at her. Then he looked at her. His expression did not change. He took his wife's arm and walked toward the drawing room. The Duke arrived last, as he seemed to prefer, and handed Harriet his coat with a brief nod. Up close, he was taller than she remembered, and there was something in the way he looked at the house. At the walls, the ceilings, the arrangement of rooms he had presumably visited often over the years, that suggested he was noting something he couldn't quite name. Harriet hung up his coat and went back to her station. Dinner was long. She moved in and out of the dining room with wine and additional courses, refilling glasses, replacing silverware, doing the work of being invisible. She listened to fragments of conversation. Bernard holding court at one end of the table about the improvements he planned for the estate, the Pembrokes asking after the Eastfields, Mrs. Latimer, seated near the middle, saying something quietly to Mr. Ashby that made him set down his fork. She did not hear what it was. After the main course, she was sent to the kitchen for the dessert plates, and when she came back, the seating arrangement had shifted slightly, the way it did when a conversation had pulled two people together or pushed them apart. The Duke was speaking to Mr. Ashby, not loudly, not noticeably to anyone not paying attention, but with the particular quality of attention he gave to things that mattered. Bernard, at his end of the table, was describing his plans for the North Field. He did not notice. Harriet set down the plates and left the room. She was in the corridor outside the study when it happened. She had gone to retrieve an additional dessert spoon from the service cupboard and was on her way back when she heard footsteps on the staircase. 2 sets, she thought, and then voices. She stepped back into the shadow of the corridor. It was Mr. Ashby, and with him was the Duke. They were speaking quietly, and she caught fragments. The box her mother kept, and then something she couldn't hear, and then, distinctly, the Duke's voice saying, "Are you certain?" And, "Mr. Ashby, I wrote it myself, 3 months before she died. I can describe every sentence." A pause. Then the Duke said, "Then it needs to be seen." Harriet pressed her back against the wall of the corridor and did not move. She heard them enter the study. She heard the particular creak of the window seat. She knew that creak better than she knew almost anything. And then a silence, and then the sound of a lock turning. She walked back to the dining room and set the spoon down, and stood with her hands folded behind her back, and felt for the first time in nearly a month that the ground under her feet was solid. She was called to the study the following morning. She had expected something. She had not expected it to come this quickly. Bernard had not come down to breakfast. Mrs. Holt had told the staff nothing. The house had the specific quality of silence that precedes something. When Thomas came to find her in the east parlor, he simply said that her presence was requested upstairs. His face was carefully neutral. She set down her dusting cloth and went. The study had 3 people in it. Bernard, seated behind the desk, with the look of a man who had recently discovered that the foundation of a building he owned was not where he thought it was. A man she didn't recognize, who had the brisk and purposeful demeanor of a solicitor, standing near the window, and the Duke, standing by the bookshelves with his hands behind his back, looking at the dictionary on the 3rd shelf. He was looking directly at it. Harriet stepped inside and closed the door. Bernard looked at her with something between confusion and the beginning of a much larger suspicion. "Margaret," he said, using the name she had given. "This gentleman has some questions." The solicitor she didn't recognize asked her, in a careful and professional voice, whether she knew anything about the study's contents, and whether she had, in the course of her duties, had occasion to enter this room. She answered honestly. She had entered the room once, she said, to retrieve correspondence that had been misdirected. She had not touched anything on the shelves. This was true. The solicitor made a note. Bernard continued to look at her. Then the Duke turned from the bookshelf and looked at her directly for the first time. There was a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not recognition, exactly, but the adjustment that happened when a picture you'd been looking at for some time resolved into something different than you'd thought it was. He looked at her face. He looked at the room. He looked, briefly, at the window seat, where the cedar box now sat open on the cushion. He said, very quietly, "What is your full name?" She could have maintained it. She had maintained it for 11 days. The gray dress and the pulled-back hair and the name from Somerset and the careful nothing of her expression. She had held all of it together for 11 days, and she was, she knew, very good at holding things together. She said, "Harriet Voss." The silence in the room was complete. Bernard made a sound that was not quite a word. The solicitor looked at his notes, then at her, then at his notes again. The Duke said nothing. He looked at her with the specific attention of someone who was recalibrating. Not in a panicked way, but in the careful, deliberate way he did everything. He was, she understood now, the kind of man who wanted to understand what had actually happened before he decided what he thought about it. "You lived here," he said. It was not a question. "I grew up here," she said. "My mother was Catherine Voss. The letters in that box are from her private correspondence. They contradict, in specific and documentable ways, the testimony provided in the proceeding that transferred this estate." Bernard said loudly that this was absurd, that she had no right to be here, that she had obtained her position under false pretenses, and anything she said was obviously. "Mr. Voss," the Duke said. Bernard stopped. The Duke did not raise his voice. He did not change his posture. He simply said the name in a way that indicated he was finished listening to what followed it, and Bernard apparently understood that. The solicitor asked if he might have a few moments to review the contents of the box. It took 3 weeks. Harriet stayed in London, at a small hotel on a quiet street, and waited. She had given her full account to the solicitor, and then to a second solicitor, and then to a barrister who had the reassuring quality of someone who had seen far worse and was not particularly worried. Mr. Pemberton, contacted for the 3rd time, had finally looked up from his desk and agreed that the situation bore re-examination. She did not contact the Duke. It was not her place to, and besides, she did not know what she would say. She had thought of him often since that morning in the study, the way he had looked at her when she said her name, the particular quality of his silence afterward. She had thought about what it meant that he had been the one to follow Mr. Ashby upstairs, and what it meant that he had turned to look at the dictionary, and what it meant that he had asked for her name at all when he could simply have waited for the solicitor to do it. She had thought about it rather too much, probably. On a Thursday, 3 weeks after the gathering, the barrister telephoned with news. The original ruling had been successfully challenged on the basis of the letters and 2 additional pieces of evidence that the renewed examination had surfaced. The estate would require a formal hearing to fully reinstate the original will, but the barrister considered the outcome, at this point, largely a formality. Harriet thanked him. She hung up. She sat in her hotel room and looked at the window for a long time. Then she went downstairs, walked to the small post office on the corner, and sent a brief letter to Mrs. Holt. She was on her way back to Ashford Park. Really on her way back, with her own trunk, with her own name on the correspondence confirming her return, when she stopped in the village at the posting house to change horses and found the Duke of Cavendish standing outside it. He was not waiting for her. He was speaking with the posting house keeper about something unrelated and happened to turn at the sound of her carriage. He looked at her. She looked at him. The posting house keeper went back inside. "Miss Voss," the Duke said. "Your Grace," she said. There was a moment during which neither of them said anything further, and during which Harriet was aware that this was the first time she had spoken to him as herself. Not as Margaret Cole, not as furniture, not as a voice providing accurate testimony to a solicitor. As herself. "I understand the barrister's news is favorable," he said. "It appears to be," she said. "I'm glad." He said it simply, without the performance that glad sometimes came with. Your mother was. She was a steady presence in this county for a great many years. The house should be yours, Harriet said. She was. It should. And then, because she was herself and not Margaret Cole, and Margaret Cole had spent 11 days saying the minimum required, she said, I owe you a considerable debt. You did not have to follow Mr. Ashby upstairs. The Duke looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read, and then was very briefly readable. I asked him about the gathering 2 years before your mother died. He described it as the finest table in Devonshire. I had reason to question whether that description still applied. Harriet looked at him. The napkins were wrong, he said, and the flowers were too tall. She understood then that he was telling her he had known something was wrong before she said her name, that he had already been looking, that the question he had asked, "What is your full name?" had not been the beginning of his suspicion, but rather the end of it. She said, My mother always kept them low, so people could see each other. Yes, he said, she did. The horses were ready. There was no logical reason for the conversation to continue. He had his business here, and she had hers, and the road back to Ashford Park was 3 miles, and the afternoon was turning the particular color of late October that meant the light would be gone in 2 hours. She said, If you find yourself in the neighborhood, Your Grace, the house will be receiving again in the new year, he said. I will be in the neighborhood. She stepped back into the carriage. The driver clicked to the horses. She looked out the window at the road, at the trees giving up the last of their color, at the familiar shape of the hills she had known her entire life. The house came into view as the carriage rounded the last curve. The gray stone, the long windows, the kitchen garden to the east that needed tending, the east wing that would flood again in spring and would need to be dealt with before then. It looked exactly as it had always looked. She was home.